group. Oh, that's wonderful. Hi, everybody. I'm Laila al-Sanna al-Andalusiyya. I live in the East Kingdom in the Crown Province of Ostgard, and I'm your instructor today. I'll tell you a little bit about myself as we're getting started. I am a professional musician outside of the SCA. I'm a composer and an opera singer. And I have been in the SCA since I was 13 years old, so that's a pretty long time now, I promise. And I've been specifically studying Ladino music as well as period Arabic music for about 18 or 19 years now. I first was introduced to Ladino repertoire actually when I was about 17 years old. My mother and I were recording an album of Jewish music, and we included a Ladino piece on the album, and that was my first introduction to this style of music, and it captured my attention and became a very important part of my life. Although I am my Judaic tradition, my Judaic background is not a Sephardi background, which means I'm not a Spanish Jew genetically. I'm an Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jew, which means my family is from Eastern Europe and also from the Middle East. But I don't personally have Sephardi Jewish heritage, but it's become sort of my adopted heritage over the past 20 years because I've become so involved in the Ladino music community. And the thing about Ladino is that it is on the list of endangered languages and endangered cultures in the world. There is a very, very small number of people living today who are native Ladino speakers, and an equally small number of people who have learned Ladino after the fact. So it's sort of considered a dying language. And I think one of the things that's sort of helping it to cling to life is the musical tradition that I study, because the music of the Sephardi people, the Ladino music that dates back to before the expulsion in 1492, is a deeply passionate, beautiful, exciting music to be involved in, and it's helping the language cling to life. I hope that this class will be exciting for all of you, and that you'll start exploring Ladino repertoire on your own, because every time someone else starts to learn this repertoire, it helps to keep this cultural staple alive. And I think that's really important. So that's sort of my intro to my involvement in Ladino music. As far as my credentials, besides that, I have a master's degree in theater, and I have been a professional musician for most of my life. I'm a private voice instructor, and I'm also the artistic director of Opera dell'Est, which is the East Kingdom's early opera company. If any of you are interested in that, you can feel free to talk to me later. We're always happy to have new people. And although it is technically the East Kingdom's company, because we're the only early opera company in the known world, we have people from all over the place who have joined us. And you don't have to be a trained opera singer to be an Opera dell'Est. There's a lot of ways you can be involved. And also the singing itself is not necessarily what we think of as operatic today, because it was a transitional period that was leading into opera. So please know that that's available to anybody who is interested in being involved in any way, including as an instrumentalist, as a director, as a technical theater person, etc. All right, I'm going to start screen sharing now. And this may take me a second. iCloud Drive. All right. I am in the wrong area. 1 second. Sorry. Screen sharing is always a tiny bit tricky. I apologize for the weird pause while I do this. Oh, I don't know which one of these is correct. Okay. Oh, not the Spanish one. Sorry, I have a Spanish language version of this as well. So if anyone would prefer, actually, when I send over the copy for them to upload onto SCA Iberia, I will also give them the Spanish language version of this. So if you prefer that, you're welcome to it. If you are a Spanish speaker, please know that while Ladino is very similar to Spanish, it's not identical, especially in terms of pronunciation and grammar, so it may get a little confusing here and there. All right. So the name of this class is Songs of Sorrow, which I know is a very dramatic way to begin an introduction to a style of music. But Ladino music is, it's a very passionate music. And while it is not only sad songs that you'll find in the rep, I think a lot of the most noteworthy pieces of music that have come out of this tradition do fall into that category. And I find that when I do a concert of Ladino music, it's like 2/3 broken heart. So that's where that title comes from. A little bit of an introduction. Let's talk first about the language. Ladino as a language is a Hebrew-Spanish hybrid, and it developed in medieval Spain. It resembles medieval Castilian in grammar and pronunciation, but it also incorporates Hebrew vocabulary, and it is written in Hebrew. This is very similar to the way Yiddish is in Eastern Europe, if you're familiar with the idea of Yiddish. Yiddish is, can someone please close this door? Sorry, I've got noise coming from the other room and it's trickling in. Yiddish is the language spoken by Ashkenazi Jews. And guys, can someone please close the door? Sorry. I have a very loud roommate. All right. So Yiddish, which is the language that's spoken by Ashkenazi Jews, is basically German written in Hebrew writing, but with some Hebrew vocabulary mixed in and some alterations to the grammar and some other exterior vocabulary that worked its way in through the Jewish diaspora. So basically Ladino is the Spanish equivalent of that. It's very close to how Spanish was spoken in medieval Spain, but it incorporates other vocabulary. And the Ladino language itself actually changed over time. It continued to be used in Jewish communities after the beginning of the diaspora. And as the diaspora happened, the language changed and sort of broke into smaller dialects, I would say. The Greek community that emerged after the expulsion has Ladino that has Greek in it. The Ottoman community ended up incorporating Turkish as well as Arabic words. But eventually all of those versions of the language sort of died out. And the one place that it continued to be spoken as a living language was Latin America. Because a lot of Jews moved to Latin America after the expulsion, and the traditions were kept alive there. Oh, by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but if anyone, I'm just having a constant stream of interruptions. Now my cat wants out. I'm sorry, excuse me for 1 second. Go, go cat, go. I apologize. This is life during a pandemic. Everybody's home all the time. Anyway, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and get my attention. I'm happy to take questions as we're going. All right. So that was my intro to the language. I'm going to move on to a quick intro to the music. Ladino music developed in medieval al-Andalus. It started to develop under what we think of as the Moorish rule of Spain, or the Muslim period of Spanish rule. And it was passed down through oral tradition, largely, although not exclusively, from mother to daughter. I particularly enjoyed this aspect of Ladino music, the idea that it was in fact a women's tradition, because so much of the music that we look at when we look at the development of European music is was firmly held in the purview of men. I enjoy the fact that this particular music actually was held in trust by the women of the community. I have a little quote here from the Nico Castel Ladino songbook. Rather than reading it, you can read it yourself. I'll sort of summarize it. which is that Ladino music, or rather Sephardi music, Spanish Jewish music in general, sort of broke down into two categories, sacred and secular, which is very much how we think of music in most of Europe, actually, sort of a division between sacred and secular. And the sacred music of the Sephardim was mostly performed in Hebrew, not in Ladino. The Ladino musical tradition is essentially the Sephardi secular music tradition from this period. And the music in that, that section included music that dealt with the life cycle, most especially, right? Birth, childhood, courting, marriage, death. These are the major topics that we see in Ladino music. I personally have noticed that they seem to be weighed quite a lot towards death and failed courtships or failed marriages in some cases. I find that there is a lot of that music in, at least that's a lot of what's survived to this day, maybe because it's some of the most emotionally resonant music, so it continued to be performed. Can't be sure. All right, now we are getting into the most academic portion of this class. There's going to be a practical part at the end. I'm going to teach you some songs, so don't feel like it's going to be all lecture, but I'm going to give you some background information before we get into the singing. So in the SCA, a very large part of what we do as artists and scientists in the SCA is that we try to recreate things that existed in period, and therefore the idea of documentation or proving the provenance of the things that we do is very important in the SCA. Ladino music poses an exceptional challenge in this area that may be new to a lot of you. As far as I know, I was the person who actually developed this particular method of dating Ladino music. And that was about 15 years ago, and it has become accepted in academic circles. So this is actually an accepted way of dating Ladino music, but it doesn't have a long history. And whenever you are doing this, it's going to require you as an artist to educate your audience or your judges about how this works. And I promise you that does pose an exceptional challenge, but it's doable. I will actually, in fact, right now, really quickly, I'm going to type this in. I'm going to give you in chat my website address. This is actually the website for my household. But on this website, there is a lot of information about Ladino music, including a form that you can fill out if you want me to do an evaluation of a song for you and tell you whether or not that song is a period song. Or if it's something I've already done an evaluation of, I can send you my documentation so that you have the information about how to prove that it is period. So I don't expect any of you to be able to do this anthropological dating process immediately. Trust me, it takes a lot of time to sort of develop the knowledge to do this. But I'm happy to provide assistance to anyone who wants to, say, enter a Ladino song in an arts and science competition or anything like that. So, anthropologically dating Ladino music involves a multi-step process. The reason this process works is because of the 1492 expulsion. So I'm going to start out by sort of explaining the anthropological principle that underlies this method. In 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they created what we know of as the Sephardi diaspora, because everybody had to leave Spain except for those who converted to Christianity. And they didn't all go to the same place. Some went to the Middle East, some went to Greece, some went to the Ottoman Empire, a smaller number went to Persia, some went to Italy. There was a dispersion that happened immediately after they were expelled from Spain. And in that process, they took their culture, which included their music, with them. And then when it moved to new places, sometimes that culture started to change and take on characteristics of the new location. So The thing that is important to understand in this principle actually has to do with oral history. Oral history is always very, very challenging for historians because it doesn't fit into European models of the correct way of proving provenance. However, there have been extensive anthropological studies that have been done that have shown that oral history, especially when it's passed on by designated record keepers, is incredibly reliable. And that reliability is very important for the process that we're looking at now. The principles that underlie this process have to do with the idea that when a song was taken all over the world, it would retain enough of the original characteristics of the original song to be identifiable. So the first part of anthropologically dating Ladino music is evaluating the geographic spread of the song in question. In other words, if I'm looking at a particular Ladino song, I'm going to say La Rosa en Florece, otherwise known as Los Bilbilicos, which is a very beautiful song in the repertoire. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find as many references to that song from different communities all over the world as I can find. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm trying to see how widespread is that song. Because if I look and I see, all right, so that song was in the Ottoman Empire and it was in Persia and it was in Greece and that's it. Those are fairly close cultures to one another. And it is in fact feasible that it could have been written in one of those places and passed around. But if the geographic spread says, all right, I've got Ottoman Turkey, I've got Israel, and I've got Argentina. If I see it showing up in such disparate locations, then there is a reliable jump that one can make to assume that they came from a single source, right? It's not hard to realize if you find a song that's basically the same song in these three locations, it had a common source that came before those people split. Now, when we're dealing with Ladino history, we have a solid date from which we can work, and that date is 1492. And because we know that, we can look at this and say, all right, so it's in these three places in completely different parts of the world. It has a common source, and the only logical common source that it could have is pre-expulsion Spain. So that's the first step. That's the first step that we have towards identifying whether a piece of Ladino music is period. The lack of that information doesn't prove that it's not period, but we can only really prove this in one direction. All right, the next step we take is linguistic analysis. And linguistic analysis requires a certain amount of knowledge about Ladino language. But the gist of the linguistic analysis component of dating Ladino music is how close to medieval Ladino is the language. And number two, how much infiltration do other languages have into this version of Ladino? Are there Arabic words? Are there Turkish words? Are there Greek words? If there are words that come from outside of the base Ladino language, it is more likely that this was written after the expulsion, or at least that it went through significant changes after the expulsion. So that's the linguistic analysis portion. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Are there any questions so far before I go on to the third and hardest part of this? No? All right. So the third part of dating Ladino music is modal analysis. If you are a musician, you may be familiar with the idea of modes. Musical modes are scales, essentially, systems of whole and half steps, or in the case of Ladino and Arabic music, sometimes microtonal steps that determine the type of key that you're in. In other words, for those of you who maybe have mostly modern musical experience, the two musical modes that we work with the most in Western music, in European music, in contemporary music, etc., are major and minor keys. Major and minor keys are both modes. So when we talk about modal analysis, we're talking about figuring out whether you're in a major or a minor key. Only in this instance, we're not dealing with major and minor keys. We're dealing with a much larger system of modes. And the system of modes that we're dealing with is actually the Arabic system of modes. We're not dealing with the Western Christian modal system. We're dealing with the Arabic system, which was known as the Maqamat system. I teach another class on the Maqamat system, which I invite you all to take at some point in the future. But the Maqamat system includes a much larger number of modes than we're used to dealing with in the West. And the reason for that is that maqam are a little bit more involved than Western modes are. Western modes are basically just a scale that we're working in, but maqamat include not only a scale, but certain specific patterns of notes, and often they're associated with specific rhythmic modes, and sometimes they're even associated with specific purposes in terms of spiritual purposes, or in some cases health-related purposes in the Islamic world. There's some fascinating medieval texts that are about how music affects the physical body. They had a strong belief that you could in fact heal the body using music. So there's some very interesting things about this relationship between maqamat and other aspects of medieval Islamic life. But Jews in this period adopted the maqamat system to their own use. Now, it's worth noting actually that the maqamat system at this time was becoming adopted in the Christian world as well. And one of the main reasons for this is that Cordoba was the center of the instrument making world. Almost all of the instruments that were in use throughout Europe, at least the high quality instruments, were exported from Cordoba to the rest of Europe. And because everyone was using instruments that were made by Arabic instrument makers, they started to adopt Arabic modes of music because that's what their instruments were made for. It's sort of like if you pick up a guitar, it's got a fret system, and that fret system is automatically going to pull you into a diatonic musical mode. The same thing happened with Arabic musical instruments. So there was this sort of spread going on all over Europe. Anyway, you see it very heavily in the Cantigas de Santa Maria and in the Trouvère songs from the period. Jews, of course, the Jews of Spain were living in a predominantly Muslim area, so they were even more steeped in these Arabic musical modes than the rest of Europe, and they adopted those musical modes to their own use. Now, for the most part, we don't see all of the Arabic music modes in use in Jewish music. We see a few specific modes most frequently. The modes that are the most heavily dominant modes in period Ladino music are a mode called Hijaz, a mode called Kurd, and a mode called Nahawand. So each of those has sort of a correlation in Western music. Nahawand is similar to the natural or harmonic minor in Western music. And I say natural or harmonic because it actually includes both. Nahawand goes, na da 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 da, but it can also go na da 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 da. That's Nahawand. Hijaz is the mode that we tend to associate the most with Arabic music. Na da 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 da. Right, you're all familiar with that. You've heard that in various. Does somebody have a question? Oh, maybe that was an accidental unmute. All right, so that's Nahawand and Hijaz. And Kurd is similar to Hijaz, but has a quarter tone in it, and I'm not going to sing it for you right now. It's not that important. There are other modes that were added to Ladino repertoire, mostly in Latin America. Most importantly, Ajam, which is basically the major mode. Na da 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 da. That key, if you hear Ladino music in that key, it may be very beautiful, but it is almost certainly not period, because that was not a mode that was used in Jewish music prior to 1492. So the modal analysis in this process is looking at the musical qualities, and most especially the scale that the music is written in, and identifying whether or not it conforms to the scales that were used predominantly in period, or whether it was a mode that was added later. There are Turkish and Greek modes that are also foreign to medieval Ladino that show up in certain Ladino songs. So these three aspects together, the geographic spread, the linguistic analysis, and the modal analysis, give us not an absolute certainty that a piece is period, but very close to that. Because the likeliness of all of those things aligning without having been sourced from pre-1492 Spain are just very, very low. So that's the essence of the anthropological dating method. Sorry for skipping back and forth through the handout here. Like I said, you have to educate your audience when you're trying to prove the provenance of this music. So if any of you are interested in taking this to sort of a competitive level, please feel free to stay in contact with me. I'm happy to assist with this process. All right. Next, I want to talk briefly about Ladino performance practice. Jewish and Arabic music were extremely closely connected in period. So the clues that we take as to Ladino performance are largely taken from what we know about Arabic performance practice in period. It's important to know, though, that there's sort of a division in Ladino music between what we think of as the Eastern tradition and what we think of as the Western tradition. Although they all sort of derive from Arabic musical modes, some Ladino music is much closer to a Western feel, and some Ladino music is much closer to an Arabic feel. So let me give you an example of that. Here's a piece of music that comes predominantly from the Western tradition. Los bilbilicos cantan que suspiros de amor. Los bilbilicos cantan que suspiros de amor. Mi neshama, mi ventura está en tu poder. Mi neshama, mi ventura está en tu poder. So this is still in an Arabic mode, right?
Bravo!
Oh, thank you. This is still in an Arabic mode. We're still hearing something that is written essentially in the mode of Hijaz Nahawand, which means it's sort of a combination of those two modes, Hijaz and Nahawand. But it has a Western rhythmic structure. It has a Western song structure, and it flows through in a way that feels like a song to a Westerner, right? Does that make sense overall when I say that? Now, here's an example of something from the Eastern tradition. And I want you to notice in particular the difference in song structure and melodic structure. Nani, 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 nani kerei, el hijo de la madre, ne pico se abagra, right? That's just a verse from this piece called Nani Nani. So what you should notice about that is it doesn't have an underlying rhythmic structure. It's like semi-improvised, and the ornamentation sort of takes over. And it has a chant-like quality rather than a song-like quality. I see a note here. It's amazing how, oh yes, it does. It sounds a lot like traditions still used in synagogues today. Absolutely. It has a quality that is cantoral in essence. By the way, if any of you are Jewish, L'Shana Tova, since we're having a class on Jewish traditions, I should say Happy New Year to all of you. It's the sacred time of year for those of us who are practicing Jews. All right, so these two different approaches to Ladino performance practice are both completely valid. They are both important representations of the Ladino tradition. The Ladino tradition spanned that whole distance. And that's sort of an important understanding to have. But when we are looking at performance practice, one of the first things we actually need to look at is, does it make more sense to approach this like a Western tradition Ladino song or like an Eastern tradition Ladino song? And sometimes you have some choice in that, and it's a question of interpretation. Most often that split actually comes down to whether someone was living in a predominantly Christian area or a predominantly Muslim area when this music was written. That seems to be one of the main factors. All right. So the interconnectivity between medieval Jewish and Arabic music is useful because there's a ton of Arabic music manuals in period. Now, unfortunately, I have to tell you that most of these music manuals have never been translated into English. Hopefully, give me a few years. That's one of my like long-term projects. I'm learning classical Arabic so that I can translate Arabic music texts, but I'm still learning, and classical Arabic's hard, so it may be a little while, but eventually I will translate some of those things so that you all have access to it. At the moment, we're sort of unfortunately dependent on the, not translations, but rather interpretations and distillations that we receive from 19th and early 20th century Orientalists. The most significant of these resources is a man named H.G. Farmer. His resources are extremely useful, but I believe to the depths of my soul that he misunderstood the majority of what he read. And that's a huge problem. He didn't have a grounding in Arabic music, in modern Arabic music, and therefore his interpretations of medieval Arabic music are problematic and don't necessarily make as much sense as one would like them to. I'm happy to discuss that at more length, and if you ever decide to take my class on period Arabic music, I will get into that to a greater degree. But there you have it. It's a bit of a challenge. All right, so I've switched the page over to Ladino pronunciation. Now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty. We're getting close to actually learning some music today. So Ladino pronunciation is similar to modern day Spanish, but it has some significant differences. It retains the vowels and the soft D consonant, which is pronounced as the. Anytime you see D, it's not D, it's the. But here are the areas where it differs from modern Spanish. The letter G before an E or an I is not gutturalized. It's not R, it's not H, it's J, right? So this actually bears some resemblance to Portuguese if you have a familiarity with Portuguese. That J vowel, it shows up both with the G and with the J. There's no H when you see a J in Ladino, it's pronounced J. The double L is pronounced as a Y, just like it is in most Central American Spanish. I know that that's something that varies from place to place. But it's pronounced Y, not J, but Y, when you see two L's. All right, the letter S is the most problematic letter in Ladino. I will tell you that I screw this up in my own singing of Ladino all the time. And the reason for that is that opinions on the correct pronunciation of the S in Ladino have changed in the past 18 years. So I learned it one way and then I had to start to switch it, which is always very difficult. So at this point, the way we believe it is supposed to be pronounced is that when it's final, when it's at the end of a word, S is pronounced closer to a Z than an S. When it's in the middle of a word or between vowels, it sounds like sh. And when it's at the beginning of a word, it's pronounced like a hard sibilant S, which is S. So you would say siete solombra salio. If it was the end of a word, you'd say las, casas, hijos, ducados. You hear that? Or ducados, rather. But if you have it in the middle of the word, it's going to have a sound closer to an SH. So bilbili, oh, no, that doesn't work. I'm trying to find a word with an S in the middle of it, and I can't think of one right now. Anyway, you'll see one later, and I'll show you. All right, the C before an E or an I is not dentalized the way it is in Castilian Spanish. It's just pronounced like S, just like it is in Latin American Spanish. So, amanecer, amanecivo, cielo. It's just a unvoiced sibilant S sound. Also Z, unlike Castilian Spanish, it is never dentalized. It's just pronounced like a Z. If you see hermoso, it's just hermoso. Dulzor, brazos, pozo, etc. The letter X. The letter X is a special letter. And if you speak Latin American Spanish, X is sort of a complicated sound in Latin American Spanish as well, where it's usually pronounced as sh, but it's sometimes pronounced as In Ladino pronunciation, the letter S is pronounced sh. And it mostly appears in, a lot of words that have a Hebrew root, but not only that. You see here I have examples, pasharo, avrish, abashar, bushqui, pashesh, because you've got the S and then the X there, desho, avrimesh, etc. That's how that X is pronounced. It's just a soft sh sound. V. V is pronounced like V. Now that may seem obvious to those of you who are only English speakers, but if you're a Spanish speaker, that's significant, because in Spanish, V is sometimes somewhere between a V and a V, but in Ladino, V is just V, always. And then we get, last but not least, to the KH sound. KH only appears in words of Hebraic origin.
I'm sorry. When you're saying,
yes,
most cases that I'm Latin American, so
yes,
to me, a V and a B are exactly the same.
Right. So in Ladino, they're not.
In Ladino, okay.
Yes, absolutely. In Ladino, a B is a B and a V is a V, and they don't cross over.
Like
they're
English.
Different. Exactly. They're different letters in Hebrew, so they were separated very, very distinctly.
Okay.
All right, so then we get to KH. KH only appears in words of Hebraic origin, and it's pronounced h, right? That's a sound that doesn't exist in Spanish, generally speaking. So you'll see it in words like zechut, malichim, etc. It's pronounced like bach, right? It's the back of the throat. It's a sort of a harsh sound if you're not used to making it, and it may take a little bit of practice. But ch is the sound you get when you see a KH. Now, this is really important. Ladino, in its natural form, is written in Hebrew lettering. And because Hebrew lettering is written from right to left, it is virtually never applied to written music, because written music doesn't get written that way. So whenever we're looking at written music, we tend to be looking at a transliteration. And in the modern day, most of the time when you see Ladino, you're going to see it in transliteration. Because it is transliterated, there's tremendous variations in spelling. And those variations are inevitable because different people are choosing different ways of translating a Hebrew letter into an English letter. Some people will translate it in a way that comes much closer to the way modern Spanish writing looks. And that tends to be easier for modern people to read. But sometimes it'll be written in something that's very close to the way we traditionally transliterate from Hebrew. And that will end with a completely different looking set of spellings. There's also a certain amount of variation in pronunciation, and that has to do simply with the fact that it is still a living language, and it has moved somewhat in pronunciation in different parts of the world. Now, in addition to those variations in spellings, there are significant variations musically as well. And one of the main reasons for that is because Ladino music tends to be very ornamented. And it's very hard to identify the line between the base melody and the ornamentation that somebody puts on top of that base melody in a lot of instances. Oh, I see I've missed some things in the chat. Oh, it was mostly just Shana Tova wishes, which is lovely. All right. So I find it really useful when I'm looking at Ladino music to look at different versions of sheet music or recordings, because then I can often identify what parts of the music are consistent across every version and what parts of it seem to differ from one person to another. It helps me to identify what the core of the song is versus the ornamentation. And sometimes that can be very complicated. So I strongly encourage you, especially if you're approaching this from a arts and sciences perspective instead of simply from a performance perspective, to look at multiple versions of the same song where you can. Now, if that's the thing you want to do, I have done something to make it easier for you, and that thing is called the Ladino Database Project. The database project is a database of Ladino songs, cross-indexed by difficulty, tempo, subject matter, and keywords. I have been working on it for more than a year. There's still a long way to go. It includes a list of all the recordings and YouTube videos and sheet music versions that I've found. It says in this that I can let you know when the database goes live, but the database is already live and you can get at it through my website. So I need to update my handout. Oh, yay! Guess what? We got to the music part of the class. Any questions before we actually learn some music? Anybody? Any more questions? No? All right. All right. So.
Well, I don't have a question per se.
Okay.
I was fooling around with Ladino and Sephardic music back in the early aughts, and started learning Ladino in order to write some pieces in it for an A&S.
Fantastic.
And the problem I ended up having was nobody was willing to judge it because nobody knew Ladino.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's a huge problem. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. Look, to be quite frank, I'm one of the experts in this field in the world, and I still only have an AOA level arts award. So I understand. People don't understand what this is all about. There's so much education that we have to do in order for other people to be able, truthfully, in order for others to be able to judge it, you have to give them an education on it, which is obviously very complex. I wish I had more advice for how to deal with that challenge. I mean, truthfully, if I'd figured it out by now, I'd probably be a Laurel.
Right? The other problem I had was even just finding Ladino speakers to show my work to and say, hey, did I do this right? Have I parsed this correctly? So it's all kind of, I still have no idea if I did any of it correctly. Or
if you connect with me after this, I'm happy to, I can give you links to some places that have Ladino courses and Ladino chats online for free and that sort of thing. And that might allow you to connect up with other people who are in this field. Unfortunately, because it's a dying language, there aren't a lot of people who are qualified to do that kind of work. To be honest, I am an expert in Ladino music, but I am not an expert in Ladino language.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a small field. It absolutely is. But there are resources out there. So connect with me and I'd be happy to give you whatever information I have about those resources.
Cool.
All right. Any other questions? Thoughts? Concerns before we get into doing some music together?
Could I just make a comment on what Chiara was saying?
Yes.
hunt down your music laurels, because they're used to working with really, really, like, not your performance music laurels, but your historically music laurels. We're used to looking at really weird stuff, and we have a sort of a basis for dealing with the unknown that is quite useful. We like to be educated, so sometimes you can give us quite detailed information about where you're coming from, and it can be taken on board much more easily than, you know, someone who is not quite as intensely into the whole thing, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is I kind of dropped everything. I moved to Aitenveld and was off in the desert learning how to put the devil into hell. And I only just got back recently. So I'm only just starting to find my old writing, and I still haven't tracked down my laurel.
By the way, that's such a good point. I have found that I've had the best reception and the most gratifying conversations with research laurels rather than music laurels. That has been my experience predominantly. I totally agree with that. And they always really enjoy the idea of new methodology and
absolutely
challenging research, because that's exciting, because it's new research. But new research is harder to prove in an A&S competition, for example.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, it is. But you can educate people and your judges enough to understand that it is difficult to prove. So, so that they don't just say, "Oh, you didn't prove anything." Chuff, chuff. They can say, "Yes, it is really, really difficult to prove." Okay, you've done a good job trying to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I once sang a Ladino song in a competition, and in my documentation I did not include a lot. I talked about Ladino music, but I didn't talk a lot about it because I didn't want to insult my judges, thinking that I was going to add too much, and they were like, "No, we don't even know about this. You should have included more." I'm like, okay. I assume that there's common knowledge for laurels, but
no, it's definitely not common knowledge. There are more people who are familiar with Ladino music today than there were when I first started doing this music. I mean, a lot more. But knowledge about the music itself, and particularly knowledge about its periodicity, is still fairly limited and fairly controversial, if we're honest, because a lot of people are not comfortable with oral tradition as the basis for documentation, which is problematic not only for Ladino music, but also for Mesoamerican studies, and for a number of other areas like that. So I am a strong believer in the expansion of what we consider SCA appropriate. I want to see more research on Mesoamerica and on Africa and on areas outside of Western Europe and what we consider sort of the cultures in the East that have been explored most in the SCA. I really am excited that there is starting to be inroads into other areas, but it always involves educating our audience and our judges. And unfortunately, we also face a lot of prejudice when we're doing this kind of work. I think anybody who's working in an under-researched area in the SCA knows that sometimes it feels like an uphill battle.
I totally agree. I do wood burning, and a lot of people look at me like, "That's not period." I'm like, how can it not be period?
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to some music, unless there's any more important questions. I'm happy to take more questions.
Singing, please.
But we've got to our last half hour, so it's a good time to start doing some music. I forgot to bring my pitch pipe in here. Does anyone have an instrument on hand? Just to, or
I have a shofar.
That's fantastic, but not probably useful in this moment.
I have a recorder.
Not useful.
A recorder is great. Can you give me a C?
I have a pitch pipe.
That's a C?
Oh, sorry.
That sounds more like it.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. That's all right. So I'm going to teach you this music the same way that this music is traditionally taught in Ladino-speaking families and in Sephardi families. And that is the way I think a lot of oral tradition music is passed down. Basically, I will sing a line, and then you will sing it back. Now, we have a little bit of a challenge here, because there's really no way to get sound coming from multiple directions on Zoom that doesn't end up being a huge disaster. So what you're going to have to do instead is you're going to have to mute yourself and sing along with me. And what I'm going to do is I will sing you a line, and then I will sing it again, but the second time you will sing it with me. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes? All right. And I've already lost that pitch. I don't usually lose a pitch so quickly. Can somebody give me that C again? Perfect. All right. Now, if you are a drummer and not a singer, I can give you a rhythm to do with this, which is kind of fun, but it's very difficult to do the rhythm and sing it at the same time, so I don't recommend trying to do both at once. The rhythm that I use to go with this goes like this. So if you want to join in with rhythm, that's what I recommend. If you don't want to sing, but you want to practice clapping or on a drum.
We lost you when you were clapping.
Oh, well, let me try that again. It goes 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3, 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3, 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3. Could you hear it that time? Awesome. All right. So the way that lines up with the music, for those of you who might want to do this as drumming, it goes like this. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí, a la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí, a las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí, a las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. And then there's a section at the end that has no drum, but I'll show you that when we get there. So that's for the drummers in the house. For everybody else, I'm going to go ahead and teach you this song one line at a time. The first line is going to go like this. A la una yo nací. Just that. A la una yo nací. One more time. A la una yo nací. All right, and the next part goes. A las dos me engrandecí. A las dos me engrandecí. A las dos me engrandecí. All right, and we put those two together. It's going to go. A la una yo nací. A las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací. A las dos me engrandecí. All right, everybody do that with me. And we're going to do it twice because it's got a repeat sign on it. So it's going to go. A la una yo nací. A las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací. A las dos me engrandecí. Everybody good so far? All right. Let's try it a couple more times for those of you who aren't really sure yet. All right. Ready? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. Let's try one more time, 2 times through, and then we'll go on to the next part. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. All right. Now I'm going to turn the page here, and you're going to be missing the first 2 words. If you look real closely at the bottom of page 6, it says alas. Those are the first 2 words of the next section. And it's going to go, a las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. That's how that next section goes. But we'll break that down. So the first part goes, a las tres tomé amante. All together. a las tres to mi amante. Again, a las tres to mi amante. All right, and then the next section goes, and this is tricky. This is a little melodically tricky. A las cuatro me casi. I'm doing that real slow so you can hear that. A las tres de mi amante, a las cuatro me. That's a real tricky little spot there. A las cuatro me casi. A las cuatro me casi. All together. A las cuatro me casi. All right, so when we put the whole line together, it's gonna go, a las tres to mi amante, a las cuatro me casi. A las tres to mi amante, a las cuatro me casi. All right, all together. A las tres to mi amante, a las cuatro me casi. A las tres to mi amante, a las cuatro me casi. All right, so the first and second sections go together. Let's see if we can put those together. I'll sing it once through and then we'll do it all together. And I'm going to turn the page midway so you can follow the music. All right. Oh, let me get some water before I do this again. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. See how that all fits together? All right, let's try that together. We're gonna try it twice. First time, and we're gonna remember to do the repeats both times. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. All right, let's do it one more time, all together. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A la una yo nací, a las dos me engrandecí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. A las tres tomé amante, a las cuatro me casí. All right, so that's the main part of the song. And then we have this cool little B section. Now, the significant thing about this B section is that properly done, this B section doesn't have any rhythm under it. The rhythm is going to cut out. If you were doing drums, you're not going to do drums anymore. Or you can do a rumble, like a fast roll through the whole thing. So this last section, I'm going to give you the simplest version of it, but this is an area that is designed for there to be a ton of improvisation. So first you're going to learn the bass melody, but then on your own, you can experiment with different ways of singing it. So the bass melody goes like this. Alma vida corazón. Alma vida corazón. All right, do that with me again. Alma vida corazón. Alma vida corazón. Let's try that one more time. Alma vida corazón. Alma vida corazón. All right, now let me show you what I mean about improvising on it. Here's how I might sing this. Alma vida corazón. Alma vida corazón. You can do anything you want there. You can go crazy on it. You can keep it simple. You can go down instead of going up. Alma viva corazón. Anything you want. So if we were doing this all together, then what we would do, and unfortunately this is too hard to do on Zoom, but I encourage you to do this on your own with groups of people when you have time to be in person with people again, is that we'll sing through the whole piece together for the rhythmic components. And then when we get to this little tail section, every time we go through it, a different person will sing it and improvise on it for as long as they want to. I always do that during classes when we do this in person, and it's really fun, but it's a little hard to do in this context. What we will do, however, is we will go through the whole song together, complete with that section at the end. And I will invite you to experiment on your own end when you get to that part. I'll just sing the bass line, the bass melody line, so that you can play over top of that. All right, let's try this together. Oh, actually, before we do that, let me quickly tell you about what the song is about, because we haven't talked about that at all. So this is what I call the Ladino playa song. It's like a rap song about about how the person who's singing it is just such a Casanova. The lyrics translate roughly to: at 1, I was born. At 2, I grew up. At 3, I took a lover. At 4, I married. Soul, life, and heart. All right, I see a question from Ronwin. Go ahead, Ronwin.
Yes, with all this ornamentation, are these songs that would have only been sung by one person? Because you can't exactly put two people together if they're doing it differently.
So most of the time, these probably were sung as solo pieces. But on a song like this, I can't be certain, but I imagine you might have seen people sing the main section of the song together, and then one person might have sung that little tail end as a solo. We see similar things in the cantigas, in the way that cantigas were performed traditionally. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. And I would say, by the way, that the majority of Ladino repertoire is designed to be sung as solo performances. Not all of it. There, you can sort of, when you're singing through Ladino repertoire, you can identify the pieces that seem like they would be sung in a group and the ones that don't. But I found the majority of the music to be essentially designed for a solo singer. All right, let's do this all together. Oh, and that little tail section means soul, life, and heart. Alma, vida, y corazón. Alma, vida, y corazón. All right. So you can read the translation of the rest of that on your own if you like, but we're going to go ahead and do this all together, because after that, I want us to do one more song before we close for the day. All right. So I'm going to give you 2 rounds of the rhythmic pattern before we start. All right. A la 1 yo nací, a las 2 me engrandecí. A la 1 yo nací, a las 2 me engrandecí. A las 3 tomé amante, a las 4 me casé. A las 3 tomé amante, a las 4 me casé. Alma, vida, corazón. Alma, vida, corazón. And now we're going to go back to the beginning again. A la 1 yo nací, a las 2 me engrandecí. A la 1 yo nací, a las 2 me engrandecí. A las 3 tomé amante, a las 4 me casé. A las 3 tomé amante, a las 4 me casé. Alma, vida, corazón. Alma, vida, corazón. All right. I hope that was fun for you. There are 2 more verses worth of lyrics here, and they fit in pretty easily. I don't think you'll have too much trouble with that. But yeah, any questions about this song? After this, we're gonna do one more song today. Anybody? Any more questions? Sorry, I'm deciding which song to do. We're gonna do this one. Ya salió de la mar la galana. It feels like an appropriate piece to do at this time because it's a piece about the mikveh. So let me tell you what the mikveh is. For those of you who are not Jewish, or even for those of you who are Jewish but don't know much about Orthodox traditions, the mikveh is a body of water that you go into for purification rituals. It's used for a lot of different purification rituals. This particular song is about one part of the mikveh tradition, which is that you go through this purification ritual before you get married. So this is a song about marriage, actually. I don't think I have the translation in here. Oh, I'm so sorry. I should have added that to this document. I'll have to add that to a future version of it. But trying to remember the translation of this. My Ladino is not actually that great as a spoken language. The essence of this song is the young woman comes out of the water in a white dress. She comes out of the ocean. Yes, you are going to get a PDF of the handout. We're going to be loading that onto the SCA Iberia page, but if anybody wants me to email it to you separately, just ding me after this is over and I'm happy to send you a copy of it. So it'll be available in more than one way. And also in Spanish, if you prefer a Spanish language handout. All right. So this song is about a young lady coming out of the ocean. Can someone give me an E, please? Perfect. All right, I'm going to sing through just one verse of this first so that you can hear what this song sounds like, and then I'll teach it to you. I'll break it down and teach it the way we did the last time. A verse is in between each of the letters in this written music, because I'm the one who transcribed this music, so it doesn't have quite as much information as some of the other songs. All right, so. Mucha chica está en el baño, mucha chica está en el baño, vestida de colorado, échate a la mar, échate a la mar y alcanza. I actually made a couple of pronunciation errors on that. Please forgive me. I'll fix those when I'm teaching that to you coming up right now. So this is a beautiful melody in the Western style. You can tell it's in the Western style because it seems like it would fit very easily into European repertoire from the time period, right? All right. So I'm going to sing a line and then we'll sing it together, just like we did on the last song.
Laila?
Yes.
Is there a way to enlarge this screen? Because I can't read any of the text at all. There we go.
How is this?
Yay!
Excellent. All right. Here we go. Mucha chica está. Just that much. Mucha chica está. One more time. Mucha chica está. All right, the next little section. En el baño. There we go. En el baño. Again. En el baño. Now let's put that whole line together. Mucha chica está en el baño. All together again. Mucha chica está en el baño. One more time. Mucha chica está en el baño. Good. All right, next section. Very similar to the last one. Mucha chica está en el baño. It's almost exactly the same as the last one, but with one fewer note. Mucha chica está en el baño. All together one more time. Mucha chica está en el baño. So if we put both of those first two lines together, it's going to go, mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. One more time all together. Mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. Let's do it one more time and then we'll go on to the next line. Mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. All right, the next part is going to go like this. Vestida de colorado. It's not as hard as it looks. I'm using my hands to help show you whether you're going up or down. Okay, so one more time. Vestida de colorado. All together. Vestida de colorado. Vestida de colorado. All right. You know, one more time, and then we'll go on to the last line. Vestida de colorado. All right, and this next line is going to go, échate a la mar. Échate a la mar. Again. Échate a la mar. One last time. Échate a la mar. And the next line is going to be just like Vestida de Colorado, but with different words. Échate a la mar y alcanza. All together. Échate a la mar y alcanza. One more time. Échate a la mar y alcanza. And then again, the same line that we had last time. Échate a la mar. All together. Échate a la mar. So let's go from Vestida de Colorado all the way through to the end, because it repeats itself, right? Vestida de Colorado. Échate a la mar. Échate a la mar y alcanza. Échate a la mar. One more time, the whole second half. Vestida de colorado. Échate a la mar. Échate a la mar y alcanza. Échate a la mar. All right. Now, let me have a sip of this water. And then Let's have a go at doing the whole thing all together. We'll go through it twice. We're only going to use the lyrics to the first verse. We're not going to do the rest of the verses so that we don't have to deal with too much Ladino all at once. All right? 1, 2, 3. Mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. Vestida de colorado. Échate a la mar. Échate a la mar y alcanza. Échate a la mar. One more time. Mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. Vestida de colorado. Échate a la mar. Échate a la mar y alcanza. Échate a la mar. All right, so I'm going to show you one more really cool thing with this song. It's sort of an advanced technique, but it's something fun for you to play around with if you want to sort of up this just a tiny level, which is that most of the time when this is sung, it is sung with a very specific ornamentation on the descending scales that you get on Vestida de Colorado and Échate a la mar y alcanza. Here's what it sounds like. Vestida de Colorado, Vestida de Colorado. Right, so this is a really funny little ornamentation. What it's doing is it's going up to the note above the note, and then it's popping back down. So it's just like a quick little flip to the note above it. Do you hear how that works? It's a little tricky. It's a fun thing for you to mess around with at home. But when you sing it with that ornamentation, the whole song sounds like this. Mucha chica está en el baño. Mucha chica está en el baño. Vestida de colorado. Échate a la mar. Échate, sorry. Échate a la mar y alcanza. Échate a la mar. Sorry, I ran out of breath a little there. I think my headache is making it harder for my breath control to stay in place. But there we go. So that's Yo Salio de la Mar la Galana. And I think I made a mistake earlier when I was translating it. It's Vestida de Colorado is not a white dress, it's a red dress. My apologies, that was an error on my part. I was just thinking of Jewish weddings in which you're usually wearing white. But I cannot explain the cultural difference there, but a lot of things have changed since medieval Spain. So there we go. All right. I think that is gonna bring us to a close for this class. I'm gonna leave this open for a few minutes for anybody who has any questions or wants any other information. I hope that you enjoyed this class. I hope you learned a little something, and I really hope that some of you will pick up Ladino music and take it to your next Bardic Circle or A&S event or whatever it is that you are most interested in doing with this music. I hope that you carry this on. Any questions?
This was awesome. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Very much.
It was great fun, if a little early in the morning for me.
Yeah, I'm on the East Coast of the United States. We've got so much international involvement these days. It's exciting, but complicated to find good times.
It works an octave lower.
Where do you find your source music?
That's a great question. So the first places I suggest looking, there is a wonderful book called the Nico Castell Ladino Songbook that is available. You can buy it as a PDF or as a physical book. Nico Costel was a great Jewish cantor and opera singer who passed away some years ago. But he did a lot of wonderful research on Ladino music, and his book is a really good starting point. But also these days, there's a ton of YouTube recordings of various Ladino music. So if you start looking up just generally Ladino music, you'll find a lot of things, actually. And as I mentioned, I have that Ladino database on my website, and I have links to YouTube videos and online recordings.
I guess the problem that I've encountered just in the past when I was doing this 20 years ago was finding sources for the music, like trying to figure out if it's like what period the music
well
is.
Yeah, that, as I talked about earlier, that is the great challenge with Ladino music. The only way to prove provenance for almost all of the repertoire is through an anthropological dating method, which is a challenging method. There are one or two songs that were recorded contemporaneously. Nani Nani, the Eastern piece that I sang earlier, that is actually one of the very few Ladino songs that is documented in period. But it's documented very strangely because it's in a 16th century book called De Musica by, oh, I'm blanking on the name of the writer. I have it in my documentation somewhere. I'd have to find it again. But it was documented by a Christian musicologist who was not even aware that it was Jewish in its origins, and it had gone through many changes by the time it was recorded. But for the most part, we don't actually have written records of most of this music.
Yeah.
What we have is the ability to make educated inferences about the origin point of music that exists in multiple places. That's as good as it gets. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Laila, can we share your database?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. It is a resource that is available for anybody who wants access to it. And as I mentioned, there's a form you can fill out on my website if you want me to analyze a particular song. I will tell you right now, don't send me a form about La Prima Vez. Everyone wants to know if La Prima Vez is period. It is not period. It is 100% post-period. I strongly suspect it was written in Latin America in the 19th century or the early 20th century. So don't ask me about La Prima Vez. It's the one I get the most often. But outside of that, feel free to submit a ticket if you want information on any song.
Thank you.
It can take me like a month to do, but I'll get to it for sure.
And what was the name of the group that you also talked about at the beginning? I'm asking because I managed the Kingdom Choir in my kingdom.
Oh, the opera group, you mean?
And how do we get information about that one? So that
Okay, it's called Opera dell'Est. That's spelled OPERADELL''EST. And we have a Facebook group that anyone can join. That's under that name. Or you can always just send me a private message, and I'm happy to send you the link.
Are you on Facebook under this name, Laila?
Oh, no, I'm on Facebook here. I'll write it down in the chat. My Facebook, my real name, rather, is, hang on. Krishna Alexandra.
Perfect, thank you.
No problem. And I generally accept friend requests from SCA people, so feel free to connect with me on Facebook.
I just don't take those over.
Yeah, you just didn't take them over.
My bad.
Okay.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments, conversation?
Is it okay if I send you the piece that I wrote?
Yeah, I would love to take a look at that. That sounds lovely. Thank you. Anything else?
Where are you? What kingdom are you in?
I'm in the East Kingdom in the Crown Province of Østgard. I live in Brooklyn, New York. In the modern world, I'm an opera singer and a musical theater composer. So my SCA life and my real life cross over quite a lot.
I'm glad that you shared your talents with us. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad that you were here. Thank you so much for coming.
This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. It was such a pleasure having all of you here. I hope you learned something, and I hope this ignites an interest in some of you in carrying this tradition on. That's my deepest hope.
I think it was fascinating. Thank you. It was great.
There's no place in my evaluation page to send a doc. Really? I should fix that.